Hello everyone, I'm Martin Hutchings from the Planning Advisory Service. Welcome to the 6th episode of In Conversation with Anna Rose. Anna is the Head of Planning Advisory Service. Hello Anna.
Hi.
This is our roughly monthly series where you can hear Anna in conversation with a variety of people involved from the world of planning and beyond about topics that matter to planning and often beyond that as well. This afternoon, I'm really pleased to welcome Adele Morris. Hello Adele.
Hello.
Hi. Adele is an old and very dear friend of Planning Advisory Service, chiefly when she was in her role
Not that old.
Not that old,
Not that old,
I didn't mean old in that sense. Chiefly when she was in her role as a former Liberal Democrat councillor in the London Borough of Southwark. And I have first-hand experience of working with Adele. And when it comes to planning and the role of councillors, there are a few that come close to Adele and her knowledge and experience. And today, Anna and Adele are going to be talking about councillors and their role in decision-making. So I'm going to hand over to you both, and I look forward very much to listening in. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And thanks for that lovely introduction. I think, Adele, you did much better out of that than me. So thank you, Martin, for that. So we're going to be discussing decision making and the role of councillors. There's been a flurry of activity, I would say, on social media, and it's over the years, it's a frequent flyer that people watch committees or have their application go through to committee and feel like the councillors don't do justice to the role. I think that would be fair to say. And so some of the behaviours and some of the language that's used at planning committees comes in for attack on social media, and it's from a wide range of people. So it can be members of the public, it can be from agents, it can just be from people who've popped in to watch a committee, but some councils come in for a lot of criticism. So when people are coming up with the solutions to this problem, quite often the ones I hear most often are that councillors should defend the decisions if they go against officer recommendation, that there should be more training and education, and that costs should be made explicit in terms of the reports going forward if members should be inclined to go against an officer recommendation. So before we get into all of that, Adele, can you explain from the starting point, I suppose, what is the role of the councillor in decision making? I think that you're the best person to set this out.
What does a councillor think their role is in decision making, or what is the role of a councillor in decision making? Maybe
you could do both. Yeah.
Well, quite. So I think sometimes we forget that although councillors have all sorts of training before, well, I say all sorts of training, they have some training before they join a planning committee, you have to remember not just why the councillors are on the planning committee, but why they are councillors in the first place. You know, they've been elected to represent, although people don't always agree with the word represent, because, you know, representing the community, you might be representing one section of the community and not the other, so there's a whole kind of separate argument about that. But essentially, you've been elected by your community, and they expect you to be doing what is right by them, you know, and the community that you represent. So that's a starting point for a councillor. So once you've been elected, and this is before we start the party politics, but once you've been elected, you know, there is an expectation from your members of the community, your residents, that you will be making decisions that are reflective of what they hoped you would make on their behalf, or what they desire. Yeah. So that's the kind of the basics of being a councillor. And of course, you know, across the country there are lots of independent councillors, you know, some of whom literally have been elected on a personal ticket. You know, they don't have any kind of political affiliations at all. Yeah. Then there's the party politics bit, which is that if you stand for election as a member of a political party, then you are also expected to have a sort of an ethos of the party politics and the general policies and beliefs of the party that you are representing. So there's a whole kind of background going on of, you know, the different political parties have slightly different ways of approaching things. Liberal Democrats in particular, of course, are, you know, all about devolving power and democratic accountability. And it's the democratic accountability bit that gets people in a bit of a tizzy, not just Liberal Democrat councillors, but councillors in general on the planning committee, because they have to suddenly make a decision about whether or not they are going to, how they're going to do this, how they're going to be accountable to their communities and still make a sound decision using all of the various policies, etc., that you need to use. So, and then on top of that as well, there might be local issues. It may be that your local party that you represent has been, or even in your ward, you could have been campaigning on certain issues. And again, there could be quite general issues, but they might be about development generally in the area. I mean, I represented an incredibly busy ward where planning was one of the most important items. In my sort of casework, planning was very, very high on the agenda, and in fact, planning across the country, it is a public engagement scenario. There is nothing. I mean, you look at Twitter. Well, maybe it's just the kind of people I follow, I don't know, but social media in particular, planning is a big thing, and people care very much about how their areas develop, and that is all shaped by planning ultimately. And the decisions, how your local plan is set out right the way through to what decisions are taken, what gets developed, it's all like linked into how your area develops. And so it's very, very it's probably one of the most watched areas of the council, actually, the most public facing, not just in that kind of planning committee decision making scenario, but overall in terms of people's engagement with the council. Probably engage more with planning than with any other department, other than on an individual basis. Obviously, education or health and social care, you might interact because you've got a child with special needs or whatever. But yes, kind of on the wider community, I think planning is one of the most interacted with departments of any council.
And particularly since lockdown, actually, where obviously many more councils have been able to have their committees online, so a greater audience has been able to involve themselves with this and the democratic process. And I think that has just grown and grown over the last few years in terms of involvement and engagement.
I think you're right, and I think obviously during lockdown, planning meetings were fully online, but a lot more now that we've had to go back into in-person decision making. There are still lots of authorities who live stream their planning meetings anyway, and then they are subsequently uploaded onto YouTube so that you can go back and watch them at any time. In some cases, I've noticed that some authorities have maintained a situation where the planning committee has to be in the room to make decisions. You're not allowed not to be now, but in some cases, officers can present remotely, and speakers, objectors can speak remotely, and and in some rural authorities that makes it much more accessible, actually, because if you think about it, if you've got to drive for an hour to get to a town hall meeting, and yours might be the last item on the agenda, and then you've got another hour to drive home at the end. It's quite a lot to expect, especially when you get like 3 minutes to speak when you get there. 3 minutes, 5 minutes, sometimes with questions. It has. You're right. It has really opened it out to people now, and to get much more engaged with the process.
Yeah, and I suppose what comes with that is that with a greater audience comes out all the critique in terms of how people are performing, what's happening, and actually, the local government and scrutiny and how we operate, all our functions. Actually, that's all part of it in a way. But I don't suppose any of us ever thought that this would all be done over social media in terms of the scrutiny of our functions, and I think that I think over the last few years this has grown and grown in terms of the critique provided on some of these platforms around local government functions.
Yes, exactly. And I have to say, councillors are all expected to engage in some kind of social media, have some kind of social media presence. But the one thing that I learned very quickly about Twitter is, read things but don't engage, because particularly on planning, but not solely on planning, but it's very easy to get really caught up in one side of an argument, whatever that argument may be. You spend hours of your life just talking to each other on Twitter and getting wound up about things, and I think that's one of the things really about planning committee is when you are sitting on the planning committee and making that decision, is trying to sort out in your head why you are there, what you are doing, why you're doing it, and try and kind of filter out all of the different voices, while still taking on board the points that all the different voices have raised and the reasons that they've raised them. But somehow you've got to just filter out the kind of background stuff, as it were, and try and focus, which can be really difficult. Yeah,
and especially bearing in mind that a lot of the meetings are hybrid or it's streamed and those sorts of things. But you go back to the days where you had a public gallery, and on some applications, absolutely heaving with people. Actually, that zoning out and keeping to brief, it's very difficult in that environment, isn't it? That both of us have sat in those environments where you've got huge crowds of people. Even if they're not making any noise, there's an atmosphere created by that, an expectation. And I think that unless you've sat there yourself, it's very difficult to explain how that feels, isn't it?
Yeah, it can feel incredibly intimidating, and we've all made decisions over something, voted for something to be approved, for example, and had at least one person in the room stand up and say, "You're all corrupt, you're all you're all taking backhanders, you da da da." So it's very easy to feel uncomfortable about it. And when I was a councillor, and if anybody said to me, I was never accused of corruption. Thankfully, they always trusted me in the planning committee. But if anybody ever said to me, I think the officers are on the take, or it's not the right decision, or it's this or it's that, I would always say to people, bring me the proof. And any proof you've got, and I mean proper proof, I will have it looked into. And of course, nobody ever did. It's just one of those throwaway lines, isn't it? People aren't happy. And also, community members have sometimes invested huge amounts of their time in, especially if it's a big planning application. They could have, spent months trying to engage along the way with the developers, with the planners, writing in their comments. They've bothered to turn up to committee. They brought their, whole team of supporters with them to committee, and and also I think they get quite, particularly if it is a big and important issue like that, I think they get very buoyed up by the fact that they've got this support, and then when suddenly the decision goes against them, they don't just go, "Oh, all right then, see you later, bye."
It becomes winning and losing, doesn't it? It's no longer really the application. It's a win or a loss, which is what I witnessed so many times in my local government career, is that it becomes so much more than that decision, and that's not just on the public side, that's on all sides. Those big applications, do you get to have a higher status almost than they came in with, which is interesting in itself. I suppose then we get on to I suppose there's a tricky issue for me, which is about popularity. So, the politicians making popular decisions in terms of planning. And is it safer, and this has been said on social media, is it safer to make a popular decision rather than a fully policy compliant decision if they oppose each other?
Well, I think some councillors think it is. And when you say safer, in the sense of, will it help me to keep my seat when I'm up for election in, could be 6 months time, say for example I was a sitting councillor now and we had elections next May, you know, I could be thinking, not that I particularly did operate this, because I had quite a good relationship with my residents, and they always understood, you know, I'm on planning committee, I do what I think is right and proper, and if I, you know, and I always go back and explain to them, because, and I think that's quite key actually, is getting your residents to understand why you're making the decisions that you're making, you know, because I think that really helps. But you know, that there is, you know, a sense that, you know, people think that they won't get voted for, they won't get voted in the next time, and if you don't get voted in, then you can't do anything at all. You know, if you're not in power, then well, actually, if you're not in power, that's a different thing altogether, whether you are in administration or opposition. And again, you see, with opposition councillors, there is sometimes a danger that they think, well, it's all right, we're in opposition, I can vote against, I'm outnumbered on the committee by members who are from the administration, you know, depending on how finely balanced. And that varies, of course. You know, you have some authorities where it's one party completely, and you have others where, you know, you literally, you know, they swap from election to election because they're so finely balanced. You know, a few councillors here and there, it sort of switches over. But often I think what is in the back of councillors' minds is that, you know, if I get this wrong, I'll be out next year, you know, in 2 years' time or whatever. And you know, of course they shouldn't be thinking like that. Sure, of course they should be, you know, taking a different decision for different reasons. And that I think officers don't always understand. I mean, I haven't been heard in my time to say to officers, if you make a decision that the community perceives as being the wrong decision, and you notice I didn't say if you make the wrong decision, because, you know, and actually I noticed even Catriona, I think, somewhere mentions the wrong decision, or some of the stuff I've been reading up in advance of today, somebody talks about officers making the wrong decision. That, well, that's the whole thing about planning, is that there are no right or wrong decisions. It's just not as clear cut as that in planning, and that's the problem.
And I think that's what we're getting to, isn't it? So, you know, that I think talking about a fully policy compliant decision still doesn't make it always the most appropriate decision.
No.
And I think this is the interesting part of planning and politics in planning and the different agents in planning. You know, so policy compliance is, for me, that's the starting point, isn't it? So does it comply with the policies? Well, if it does, that's great, isn't it? But there's still a process.
But even at that, you know, I was on the council for 16 years, and I was on the planning committee, large and smaller ones, for the majority of that time. Did I ever see a perfect policy compliant application? You know, and that is the whole point about planning, isn't it? It's about what weight you give to what policies, you know. And we had, particularly in an inner city area, you know, we had some huge developments, sort of, you know, 30, 40-story towers. You know, some people would lose their sunlight and daylight, but, you know, we were getting, I don't know, another 300 homes. And so, you know, the balance was always going to be weighed up about whether or not, you know, this scheme couldn't go ahead on the basis that a few people would have slightly reduced sunlight and daylight versus, you know, the provision of another 300 homes or whatever it might be. So, you know, but of course, those are the difficult bits, because that's when you are personally affecting individuals, and they are often the hardest decisions, actually, I have to say, where you're having to weigh that sort of balance up, where you know that there will be a level of benefit to somebody somewhere.
And I think it's that thing about, you know, so officers will recommend, and they will recommend a balance of decision to you as the committee. And then you're then in that place where you're looking at those individuals and then the overall effect of the application and balancing the two, you know, in terms of that. And I think when looking at that decision-making process, quite often that isn't really understood in terms of the balance and how the arguments are run. And why do you think that is? Why do you think that people struggle to understand the politician's role on the committee in that case? You know, the officer says it's fine. So why are the committee now in a quandary?
Well, that brings the whole question of why do we have a planning committee?
Yes.
Because, you know, I never saw my role at the planning committee as being there simply to sign off the officer's recommendation. I always saw my role at the planning committee to be looking at the on balance recommendation that had been made and think about whether or not I thought it was on balance in the right ways, or whether, you know, because policies, every local authority's local plan has got competing policies in it: your economic policy, your housing policy, your affordable housing policy, your green environmental policies, etc., etc. You know, that you know, they're quite often almost conflicting with each other, and you are having to make decisions about, you know, we need more housing, we need more social housing, and we've got a green space here which is a bit of a sort of scrubby green space that nobody's really cared about for a long time, and lo and behold, you say you're going to put 10 council homes on it, and suddenly, you know, it's everybody's allotment. You know, but it is that balancing act which I think is really hard. So yeah,
because I think also it looks at, doesn't it, it starts to when officers put something forward that the community have understood, and then something different happens at committee that probably another part of the community agrees with. How is trust affected in that relationship? Because obviously I see that there's different triangles of trust within local government planning. So the one that Paz often picks up on is the one between officers and members. You know, when we're doing peer reviews, this is often a subject that comes up. But there is also, obviously, the third point of the triangle is the public. And all the recent surveys have said that the public have no trust at all in the development process or any of us that act within it. And I think that's really sad for all of us. I think that the fact that the public look at us and don't trust that we're going to do the right thing by them is quite something. But I also think that what we see when we do our work as in some councils where that relationship between officers and members has broken down to some extent is also quite worrying for local government. So how can trust be built in that environment? Do you have any ideas, Adele?
It's a really difficult one. I mean, I think communities are given the impression that they can have some kind of influence on planning decisions, and indeed they can. Up to a point, and you know, but at the end of the day, they can't have, I think, as much influence as they'd like to. And one of the really interesting ways that this has become quite apparent in places where there are neighbourhood plans is that, you know, people put a huge amount of volunteer time and energy into creating a neighbourhood plan, which then gets voted on by the community and becomes a, you know, a living document that sits alongside all the other planning documents, except it doesn't have the same level of you know, it's one of the documents, and you know, and residents quite often think, communities quite often think that the local plan takes precedence. Because it's kind of, you know, they see it the other way. They see it the other way up. They see it that the neighbourhood plan is their kind of plan, and everything starts with that, and then the others sort of slot in. Whereas, of course, the reality is that it's the government's NPPF. Then, in a way, it also comes top down from them. And I think, you know, in some ways, I think that has not helped the process. Plus, of course, a lot of people start out on neighbourhood plans thinking that they can use it to stop things from happening, and that is never, of course, what neighbourhood planning was about. It was always about identifying areas that in your neighbourhood where you'd be happy to see growth, as opposed to stopping things from happening.
Yeah, and having more of a say in how that growth happens. So it's about enabling, but it's about that greater say in that. And you're absolutely right. I think the transfer of the plan, so the neighbourhood plan, into the council and becoming part of the development plan is often a really hard divorce situation in terms of, you know, the community and the council. Because it's handing over something, like you say, people have put years into often. and they've had to do the hard-won battle of winning support locally and all of that, and then it's literally handed over to be part of this big plan. And I think that is really difficult for communities, certainly the ones I've worked with. Some have been done really well and that relationship has been maintained, and others, I don't think, from what I've seen, it just hasn't gone the way that the community expected it to. And I don't know if that is because, like you said, the expectation that, you know, this is king, and all decisions in our area will be made against this, rather than seeing that it's part of an overall plan for the area. I think you could be right in terms of that. One of the things that people often struggle with in local government is whether councillors should be involved in pre-application advice. And you know, when I started looking at this, I thought, well, maybe that is the point at which you stop getting so many overturns at committee, because you've had councillors involved right from the very beginning. They know what the discussions have been, so they understand the context a bit better in between the council and the applicant, and then coming through committee. Do you have a view on that? Because councils are usually very Marmite on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really good, and I think even, you know, on the members of the planning committee, I think you know, should take, particularly on some of these big schemes that are going to take a long time to go through the process. I think there's absolutely no harm at all, as long as it's managed. If you're on the, you know, if you're on the committee, because we have this whole thing about predetermination, not predisposition, of course, which does not stop you from making a decision, but the predetermination issue does. So, I mean, I'd always urge caution if planning committee members are going to kind of dig more deeply or delve more deeply, you know, into how they do it, and ideally, you know, have facilitated meetings with officers is the best way to do it. Go and have site visits if you're not quite sure. You know, it never ceases to amaze me when I go out and do planning reviews, and you know, in planning committee training, how many people, you know, you get to the planning committee and then they say, oh, well, let's defer it for a site visit. And I'm thinking, why didn't you think about that before? You know, why haven't you properly read the papers in advance and thought, I don't quite understand how that bit of it works. Maybe I need to go and see it in practice. And I know that every now and again somebody will throw a curveball in a planning committee and you go, oh, I haven't really, you know, I thought I'd read the papers and I thought I'd really understood it, but I hadn't quite grasped that particular point that somebody's just made. And now I'm not quite so comfortable, especially if that is a point that you might suddenly think, actually, that might completely, you know, throw the whole thing out, or, you know, how we should be approaching this. But it doesn't happen that often, and certainly not as often as I see members on planning committees deferring for a site visit, you know, because I think a lot of the time it is unfortunately used as just a way of not making the decision. You know,
I was going to ask you that. I don't know if it's always so much as they need to see the site as they need a little bit longer.
Yes, it's a bit of a controversial decision, and they're not very comfortable about making it. And sometimes, you know, it varies. But yeah, I can't remember why I went off on that tangent. You asked me a specific question. I don't think I've answered it.
So I think you did answer it, Adele.
The other thing I was just going to say about pre-app, of course, is that, you know, if you've got a 3-member ward, and this is what I used to do, is that I would get my colleagues on the ward, my 2 ward colleagues, to do all of the kind of really in-depth pre-app, really working with the communities to understand what their concerns were about any planning application. And then you get them to come and present. You know, they send in the objections, or they come and present at committee, and, you know, it frees you up to still, I mean, again, you know, the thing about planning committees, sorry, I've got a bit sidetracked, but the thing about planning committees is there are no hard and fast rules about whether people should speak, you know, whether ward councillors should or shouldn't, you know, sit on committees. Now, I always did sit on the planning committee when there were items in my ward, but if I was going to do that, I would always make it very clear that I'd had no engagement with the community. I didn't ever give my views in advance of it about what I thought of any application. I left that to my ward colleagues to do. And that's the other way of, of trying to get around the pre-app, so that you, and again, your ward colleagues, you kind of train them to work with the residents as well, and help them to understand the planning process. Because also, if it's the first time you've engaged with the planning process, suddenly, you live in a quiet village and suddenly 1,000 homes are going to be built behind you, and you just go, somebody's got to kind of really talk you through how it all works.
Well, actually, there's some really simple things, and we've been talking about this in the design sort of area, but actually reading plans is a skill. And
oh yes,
and standing on site and making that plan legible to the site you're standing on. And I think that point, sorry, the reason I'm raising this is because when you said the 1,000 homes on the edge of a village or something, actually that's really hard to visualize.
Yes,
it's really hard, and it's sometimes even harder when you've got the plan in front of you to think, how does that fit on there? How does that work, and what does that look, and where does that bit of land come in? And I think, through my history in local government, that sort of role between members and officers and the developer in the early stages of an application, that fact finding, the legibility of the plans, those sort of things, and what does that mean and how does that sit, are really important, because by the time you get to committee, I think it's too late by that point to start discussing those things.
Oh yes.
And so for me, there is an amount of information that is appropriate at the beginning in pre-app that won't have any influence actually on the end decision, but will improve the decision making process. And I think that, for me, when I look at the journey, is where it's important to engage, because dealing with 6,000 home sites, huge employment areas, I wouldn't expect anybody to be able to do that justice in 10 to 15 minutes at a committee, having never engaged with it previously. I think that you do have to bring people along with you. I was interested in your view on that. I just think it's so important that we don't leave people out of the process when we know ourselves it's tricky.
Yes, because planning committee, and I've often been heard to say, it is not the start of the process, it's the end.
It's the end.
Unless it goes to appeal and it gets called in by the Secretary of State or the Mayor or whatever, but nominally,
it's an ideal world.
But it's not the place to be suddenly asking for a whole heap of conditions and sort of shouting across to the applicant. I mean, I have seen it happen a couple of times where it's been useful, but the shouting across to the applicant and saying, how would you feel about? I mean, I'm trying to think of examples where that might happen. So, that something might really hinge, the objections might really hinge on the hours of opening of a particular premises. And, ideally, again, you would have had the conversations beforehand. But if suddenly somebody raises an issue and says, look, this is, all the others close at this time, or you might want to just say to the applicant, whether you do it in an adjournment or what process you use, but you might want to say, are you willing to have a condition on that wasn't on before, to say that you'll close at 10 o'clock and not 11 o'clock, or whatever that might be. But little things like that maybe, but it is not the time for completely. And our chair of planning actually at Southwark, it's changed now, it's a different chair, but the chair that we had would always be very clear and say, we're making a decision on what you see before you, on the planning application that is before you, not the planning application you would like to see before you. It's the planning application. And I think that was, that is a really important piece of advice, because it's so easy for members to just go off on a tangent about, well, what about if they didn't put that wall there, or what about if they,
we've all went through those committees.
And it's like, seriously, if the planners and the applicant haven't been through those processes, then there's something going wrong in the processes leading up to committee, if those arguments haven't already been fully explored, quite frankly.
But we've all, as I said, we've all been through those committees. I've certainly watched them, and I think that some of those questions, actually, Adele, if we're being fair, some of them might not have come up in the pre-app and might not have been addressed. But yeah, a lot of them are looking for something that isn't there, basically. And that line that you said, that the chair said, I've experienced that as well. And I think it is really good to set that foundation in early at a planning committee, that is what we're dealing with. We can only deal with what's in front of us, you know, and that is worth repeating every meeting, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. And actually, if you really believe that what is in front of you is absolutely not the right application, and that your officer's recommendation is incorrect, and you believe for all of those reasons, then you simply say, well, I recommend refusal on X, Y, Z, whatever your grounds are, rather than, well, let's try and tinker with it now and fix it, in the middle of a public meeting.
I also think it looks really bad to people watching when that starts to happen, because it plays into that thought that whatever you agree can be changed. Yes. And I think in terms of trust, that is where a lot of the erosion is that, well, it doesn't matter what they decide there, what we get built is something completely different, and I think that plays into that. So
I had also, sorry, just to go back to that whole sort of pre-app and that kind of not changing things on the spot. I did some years ago when I was young and naive. I did raise something at a planning committee, and I can't remember if it was about Section 106 or whatever it was in relation to, and it was like, well, we can't really do anything about that now. And the developer or the developer's agent, who does a lot of work in the authority, said to me afterwards, Adele, if you'd have asked me about that 2 months ago, this is this is a major scheme. If you'd have come and talked to me about that a couple of months ago, we probably could have done that.
Yeah.
But we can't. Yeah. But we can't do it. In the middle of the planning committee. But and again, so that's the thing about pre-application conversations.
And it's about having the most appropriate conversation at the right point in time. And I think there are ways of doing it that are really, really helpful. So and clearly you don't want members going in and bartering with developers over what they would like, but there's ways of giving your ideas that don't involve. So I suppose, for me, should a councillor ever have to defend an appeal that the councillor's made?
Always.
The decision.
Always. You do either by the written, especially, well, if you're the person who has proposed the motion, I think, or if you're the chair, again, different authorities do things we all have slightly different ways of doing the voting process. But absolutely, I would not put my hand up and propose something for refusal if I wasn't reasonably confident that I could, that I had a good reason or several good reasons, but not too many. Actually, because somebody was saying, I came across this recently, and it's like, oh, we could add in this and we could add in this, because that's the other thing about decision making, is sometimes when members do propose a refusal, it is a different decision from the officer's recommendation. There's this terrible temptation to say, oh, and let's add in this, and what about height, scale and massing? Let's put that in as well, and sunlight and daylight. Oh we'll put, kind of, but it doesn't. You just need one sound reason for overturning a planning application at the end of the day. But no, always I think it's very unfair that you expect officers to defend your decisions.
And have you defended decisions then, Adele? Have you gone to?
Well, yes, I have. We've had actually very few. So this is a thing. So we have had very few overturns in Southwark, but the one that was proposed, actually, I can't remember if I proposed it or seconded it. But yes, I did speak and explained my reasons. Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't expect officers obviously have to do all of the background work, and they have to also present. And again, authorities do that. Different authorities do it in different ways. I came across an authority recently that actually has an appeals officer.
Yeah, some do.
Yeah, which is in some ways quite worrying that you need to have a member of staff who deals with your appeals. But
and also it's sort of it's interesting, isn't it? So some councils do that, and other councils have each of the case officers will deal with their own appeals. And in an end-to-end sort of way, you would go with the person who knows most about the application defending the appeal, because they've worked it all the way through, even if they've worked it through to recommending an approval and then have to work, they still know more about that than would be the idea. Whereas having an appeals officer who knows a lot about the appeals process, but not necessarily about the individual applications, which is, you know, so people cut it up whichever way they choose. I think I'd always go with the person who's done the work on the application, just because of the knowledge base.
Having said that, of course, it seems terribly unfair that, you know, they've spent all their time, you know, and they have thought long and hard and given it careful and thorough consideration and come to a particular conclusion, to then have to suddenly come to a different conclusion. So, yeah, but as you say, there's no right or wrong way of doing it, you know, different
it's different authorities do it. I think the awkward question, obviously, appeal is, and you know, so and so planning officer, did you not recommend to committee the approval? And then you're here saying that you're arguing yourself back down the hill. I think that's the most awkward part of the appeal in that case. And that is, you know, and you know, the RTPI Code of Conduct says that, you know, planners shouldn't be put in that position. When I looked at that, though, I thought, gosh, which planner in the country has never had to argue the opposite of what they, or, you know, some variation of what their professional view takes them to? I would find that really hard to believe, but it's interesting that it's in the Code of Conduct. So that's, and I think my point would be that my point there isn't just about public sector planners. I think it applies across the board. I think we all have to do things that we're, you know, maybe not fully committed to in terms of that, in terms of profession. So avoiding unsound decisions, though, in terms of if like you say, yeah, absolutely, councillors should defend decisions if you know they've put forward a sound reason and they can defend it, they should have a role in that. But how do you avoid unsound decisions then? You've done a lot of work with us on committees.
Well, you can't, and you know, and it's interesting because I'm having a chat with somebody from the Planning Advisory Service in a couple of days' time about something else, but I have also raised with him this issue of, well, you know what, so first of all, in terms of the training that planning committee members get, quite often, you know, you have the elections in May. Sometimes people are kind of, you know, they've just become councillors and someone's got to go on the planning committee. Oh, and this is the other thing as well that we haven't touched on. So, you know, some planning committees are huge, and trying to find enough people to put on the planning committee means that actually some of those people might not want to be on planning at all. They might have no interest in it, or they might even not like it. And similarly, the person who is made chair may not be the best person for the job, but they may be the person who's been a councillor the longest. They may have the most friends, because of course chairs are normally appointed by, so they're confirmed at full council. All of those committee committee places are confirmed at full council, but you are put forward by your own group. So it's your group that decides who's going to be the leader of your group, who's going to be the chairs of the various committees. Who you're not going to come as a surprise to anybody. It's not always the best person for the job. You know, sometimes it's who your friends are, it's who's earned it, who's, I don't know, all sorts of reasons. And that is, you know, no different for planning committee, unfortunately. And so you get elected in May, and then you find yourself on the planning committee, and then, you know, because everything is backed up, always, particularly in the election year, or in some cases in election thirds, where every 3 years they have elections and they have 1 year off. You know, so you know, you had the elections, you're just about getting your head around it, everything's backed up, got a load of planning applications waiting to come to committee that are all in the pipeline. So you've got to do it quite quickly.
Yeah.
So you've got to do a quick sort of training, which is often your lead planner, your head of service, planning service or whatever, and hopefully a legal planning person. And, you get a kind of, I don't know, a couple of hours of training and then off you go. And some places are better than others at having training along the way. Some places insist on regular training. Some places that'll be it for 4 years.
Yeah.
If you're on a 4-year cycle, unless you come onto the committee for the first time, and you have to always have had the training before you go on the committee, obviously. But in some places that's it. Other places, we do committee training. PAS does committee training, and that's one of the things that I've been doing. But even training doesn't necessarily, people don't always understand. I mean, I have watched planning committees where we have recently, or not so long ago, done training with those committees and thought, did you listen to anything we said? Did any of it go in? Because so I think that training is good. I think we need to the thing that I'm going to have a chat with someone from the team about later on is whether or not there are any things that we can tweak in the slides and in our approach. But training has to be done, should be done, and it will have an impact. But it still doesn't always get you beyond that. And if somebody has come into the training session with the mentality that they think they know everything anyway, there's nothing I can learn, I've been doing this for years, you can't teach me anything, or they come in and it's like, yes, I see that, and then their residents turn up at planning committee and they go, oh god, I can't vote for this though, I'll be in trouble, and it all goes out the window because it's very intense, it's very emotional, and it's very public, the planning committee, and you've got to think on your feet. You're like a rabbit in the headlights sometimes with that. You can't kind of say, oh well, give me a week to think about that. It's like, no, the decision is there and then. So
actually, there is something though, isn't there, about the relationship between the officer team and the members on the committee in terms of sound decisions, because the more information that you're given to make your decision, the better your decision is going to be. And I'm not talking about the actual outcome of the decision. I'm talking about the route to that decision is going to be improved by that relationship. And I think that's for me is where that decision seems to come out more commonly, is where that relationship is broken down. And so there isn't enough communication, that where the communication happens, it's not good. And it's certainly not consistent and frequent enough. And so the chain of communication running up to committee is broken for me. And that's where unsound decisions start to be frequent, rather than, the exception to the rule, which you talk about, Adele. Yes, they do happen, but they should be the exception, shouldn't they, in terms of this? And I think, there's a risk, isn't there, for the council reputationally of that frequency of unsound decisions, because it's not just about the decision being flawed in that way, in terms of the advice the committee maybe hasn't been good, then the committee don't make a great decision. That's all viewed in the public, so you get that reputational thing. But then we also get into costs then, don't we, which and the accumulation of costs against the council for that decision making process. And I think that when we look at the breakdown of the relationship between officers and members in terms of some councils, this then creates a cycle. So that bad news story then creates that rift, which means that each side is almost blaming each other for the problem that has just occurred. You see as much of it as I do, I'm sure you do, but is there, I suppose the way I would set about that, if I was talking to a council, would be, that advice on relationship management. I think it comes down to human characteristics. Is there anything else that you would suggest when people have got to that cycle stage of decision making?
Well, I think the whole feedback. I mean, I'm always amazed, and actually, we didn't do it at Southwark, but then I suppose we had fewer refusals.
Yeah.
But you know, but again, I've been out and worked in authorities where you know, in supporting authorities with reviews, etc., where you know they're having lots of overturns and lots of appeals, and they don't know, they're not getting any feedback from the officers about, you know, what's happened after, you know, they refuse something and then it's gone and it's off their sort of table, as it were. And I think it's really, really important that officers are feeding back to members, look, you know, and having sessions with them and saying, you know, this was the appeal decision, you know, or rather, this was your decision. It went to appeal. This is what happened, and this is why it happened. Because then members can learn from that. But if you're never going back and explaining to the members, you know, what or even telling them that they have lost appeals. I mean, some members just carry on, don't really give anything much thought. And then the next thing they know, you know, something's being built and they're jumping up and down and saying, oh, we refused that at committee. Why is it being built? And it's like, well, because it went to appeal. And it was allowed by the inspector, and you know, so I think there's an awful lot. And of course, the problem is that, as we all know, the planning profession is grossly understaffed. Across the country. And so I think it's about that sense of you know, of balancing everything out and saving time. You know, sometimes there are some things that you can do that in the long run will save you time. But if you don't do them, then you know you'll use up your time, etc., and you're always behind. And I think it's a little bit like that with appeals. I think if somebody in a planning team is given the responsibility of sitting down with councillors who are refusing a lot and explaining, and it's not just about the costs. You know, it is about the reputational damage to the authority. It's about whether or not developers will think, gosh, I'm not even going to submit applications. You know, I'm not even going to buy land in that authority anymore or propose some kind of development. I'm going to go somewhere else, which of course some members might think great. But you know, and actually, so I forgot to say this early on as well, that, you know, for a lot of residents and a lot of councillors, they don't really understand the significance of development management being called development management. In other words, a landowner is entitled to develop on their land because they own it. And the role of development management is to manage what they put on that land in accordance with national, local aspirations, policies, or whatever. But you know, there's, you know, a lot of people will talk, and that's also about the mistrust with planners. Oh well, you know, of course planners have recommended it for approval, because they always recommend it for approval, you know, because they're just help, you know, they're there to help the applicants. Like, yes, actually, kind of. They're kind of.
And then you get into, and we won't get into it today, but who is the customer in terms of a council is a very interesting question, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
In terms of this, so
that's another session altogether. That's another
session entirely. But the cost issue is something that, I can't get my heart into this in terms of explaining the implications of going against an officer's decision in the report that the committee are to consider. I have trouble getting my heart and head around that, because what you don't want to do in an officer's report is use, I suppose, non-planning grounds to lead a discussion, and that's why I find it quite difficult. You know, we have similar issues with explaining the, you know, housing delivery test, 5-year housing land supply, those sort of things in reports. And I know that committees that I've watched and committees that I've, you know, that I've been the lead officer on, have found that very difficult, having officers describe to them the situation that they know, that they're, you know, in public as they're about to make the decision. How do you feel about that? I think it's, you know, it's a delicate issue.
It is a delicate issue, but I think, that sometimes members don't like being told publicly. I mean, I didn't used to like it at Southwark when they would say, well, councillor, you know, costs, da, 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 you know, because I think what committee members should be focusing on is this the right planning application for this site? Yeah. Does it meet with the policies? Does it meet with the community's aspirations insofar as, you know, we can meet with the community's aspirations? And in a way, your local plan policies should, at least to some extent, meet with the community's aspirations, one would hope. And I think that the rest is almost a distraction, actually, because you should be looking at, you know, is this the right, and is, you know, whatever decision I'm going to make, you know, do I believe it's sound? Do I believe that, you know, that these reasons are the right reasons and they're sound reasons? And actually, I think we shouldn't really get tangled up in whether you would or wouldn't, you know, unless you've made it. And I think that shouldn't be sort of said too early on. I think there's nothing wrong with a member sort of saying, well, I think, you know, on such and such a grounds, you know, I propose a motion to refuse, or however, you know, however they do it. And it's not unreasonable for a legal officer or a planning officer to say, well, councillor, you know, just be aware that that particular, you know, decision, you know, that particular policy is quite weak when balanced against the rest. So you might need to give it more consideration. But I just don't think the money should be. I mean, it is important, but you see, I think that's where the follow-up happens. Yeah, when people have made the decisions and lost appeals and had costs awarded against them, that, you know, that they need to understand that that's what's happened and have an explanation of why that happened, so that they can learn from it. And
that's the monitoring, evaluation, and reworking, isn't it, of the system? Yeah. You know, that's sort of where that learning gets embedded into the process. And I do wonder, having, you know, the costs in a report, what learning do you get from that? That's sort of where I come from when I look at it, and there are better experts than me out there on this, but it just made me feel a bit, actually, I'm not sure that sits well with me. And I don't think it plays out well with the public either, because they see that as a bribe to the committee from the officer team. I think they see it as leading, and I don't think it plays out well where you do that sort of thing. You know, that difference between being informative and threatening in terms of some of this information, and I think we have to be really careful that we're not seen as the latter when we're working in the public. So I suppose where we get to, because a lot of the things that people point out, I think, are less about process and more about behaviours. So some of the behaviours that are drawn out from planning committees are about the way people speak to each other, and you know, I suppose that common thing, if you're going to say something, be kind. And I think sometimes some of the committees that are commented on social media, there is a lack of kindness in the way that people treat each other, but the solutions that people come up with are often procedural, and procedures aren't going to fix how people talk to each other. I don't think so.
No, although there are some. So again, this is what part of the conversation I want to have later on in the week about what the content of the training, because there is an element of it that is procedural, about behaviours, making sure that you call people properly by their names, councillor, or whatever, or whatever procedures that you decide. But yes. The whole kindness thing, but again, you see, I think people get because it can be so emotive. I think sometimes people forget we're sitting effectively in a courtroom style scenario, and we should be on our best behavior, and I think the only way you can do it is through procedural, actually, is in the protocols, and then in the training, just sort of reminding people, having a section, reminding people on, and it's things like, it's really silly things like how people sit You know, are they leaning back on their
Yeah.
chair? You know, are they doing something so that people can look and think, is he on his phone there? You know, what's
Yeah.
he doing? You know, it's
actually,
yes,
you
not
saw
talking over people, all those kinds of things that, yeah.
You see, I started talking over you when you said not
Sorry.
talking over people, so I came in perfectly then. I was just going to comment that during lockdown, when Paz were watching committees, you know, when we were looking at how the committees were working, and yeah, some people had glasses of wine.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh yeah.
It was a whole different view of how you know, we're so used to seeing very formal committees, and that was quite an eye-opener actually in terms of how people reacted to being on screen. And
I think there's a bit of a hangover from that still. I think even though people are back in the room now, I think they've got out of the habit of, you know, putting on smart clothes and sitting up at the table and kind of, you know, being more respectful of each other. You know, they haven't got anybody with a mute button anymore to stop them from talking over people and things like that. And I think, you know, some different behaviours got established during lockdown, and I think people are, you know, finding it quite hard to shift back again to what, you know, to what it used to be.
Because you want your committee, it is formal, isn't it? It is a formal process, and you want your committee, you don't want it to be austere, you want it to be welcoming to the public, and for you know, for plain English to be spoken and all those sorts of things. But it should be conducted in a civil way. You know, that's what we all expect, really, isn't it, of committees? And I think some of the commentary that I've seen on social media suggests that the shock is as much about those behaviours that you've just talked about, Adele, as it is about, you know, the operation and the decision making. Almost is that we've slipped in terms of our public presentation in terms of that, which I think that's something probably that when you discussed with I presume it's Pete to discuss the training, that if we can include some of that would be brilliant, because I think that's something that we do need to address when we're looking at committees. So I
was just going to say that, because the word that we haven't used, I don't think, in this session when talking about planning and planning committees and the whole process, is perception. It is a huge part of, you know, how people perceive the decisions have been made, you know, whether their perceptions are correct or incorrect or whatever. And so much around planning is about the perception of how things are.
And I found myself saying that quite a lot in my roles in local government to teams, is about, well, how would that member, that, you know, that resident in that street feel about what you're suggesting? You know, how would they feel about it? It's not really about looking at the rule book, it's about trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and understand how they're going to feel about it. And I think a lot of local government is like that, is we have to try and turn ourselves around and look in, don't we, in terms of how things are perceived. And you're right to bring that up, as our perception is a key part of reputation in terms of. So I think I'm going to have to sum up. I think we've probably got to the end of a really, really interesting discussion. I think I could have gone on much longer with you. You're fascinating. So I think it is a growing problem. I think we've started to get to grips with, I think lockdown probably has helped in some ways by improving engagement, but has probably not helped in terms of our formality and presentation in terms of committees. I think the suggested remedies that people come up with, you can always have more training. You know, we would always say, yes, more, better training, but it doesn't take away from somebody being in the room and facing a public gallery. Training just can go out the way, can't it, at that time? So don't expect it to solve everything. I think I really like your viewpoint on whether councillors should be expected to defend their decisions, and I think that's refreshing, because I think a lot of people would not say that. So I think that is refreshing. And the cost issue, I think, is bring it in later in the process. you know, as a lessons learned and as an evaluation piece. Let's not start highlighting everything that could go wrong at the beginning of a committee.
Exactly.
I think that's important. But I think the thing that I would like people to take away from this discussion with you is that whatever we put in place to ease this situation, to improve things, has to be in the pursuit of earning back the trust of the public. And so punishing the committee, punishing officers, you know, anything like that, I don't think serving that purpose. I think that everything we do has to be with that aim in mind. And if you're working with Pete on our planning committee training, then I'm sure we're going to come up with a better product and be able to help councils. But also, if any of the listeners have any ideas of how we can do better things with committees that aren't drastic, we'd be really open to hearing them. Is there any final words you'd like to say, Adele?
I think honest conversations actually at the heart of it all, you know, breaking down the trust, you know, is all about decisions being taken behind closed doors, people not being heard, people's views not being taken seriously, all those kinds of trust issues, you know, are largely, I think, around the fact that we're not having honest enough conversations, and it's not helped always by the kind of national narrative. I mean, you know, we had in the kind of run up to the leadership contest, you know, I was aware that I can't remember who said what, because quite frankly, it's all become all of that is a blur right now, who's who and who said what. But, you know, somebody was talking about abandoning the housing numbers, you know, and, you know, because that was obviously will please some people in some areas of, you know, not having to do the housing numbers anymore. And then somebody else was talking about, you know, making, you know, relaxing the rules to make it easier for planning applications to go through. And I think we have this whole constant sort of narrative going on about the planning system, and you know, and I think that just I think people are just genuinely confused about what they can and can't do, who can and can't do what, and how ultimately, how do you make sure that whatever you deliver through the planning process is actually going to meet the needs of the communities that it is meant to be meeting the needs of.
Yeah, and I think, you know, going back to my first in conversation with Hugh Ellis, where we said actually a better understanding of the purpose of planning and what it can and what it can't do, actually would be a really good start, wouldn't it?
You'd have to shut down the whole. You'd have to shut down the whole of social media though before that can happen.
Oh, the power, Adele, the power! If you could do that. So thank you so much for coming and having a conversation with me today. Always, and thank you for all your work with PADS. We really, really do appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me, and yeah, I hope I've said some useful things.
Oh, you definitely have. Yeah. And goodbye. I hope you all enjoy listening.
All right, take care. Bye.